All right. It's funny, the volume level just went down, but everyone's still standing and at the back. So it's like everyone just quieted down while standing. It's fascinating.
They're
Yes.
hoping they're
Let us
hoping you
worship.
won't notice.
Yes. All right. We are going to, and honestly, I just want to reiterate this. Both Todd and I, our hope and our goal is to give you as many tools and constructs and paradigms to help you in your task of equipping the saints for the work of ministry. So we're going to be drawing a lot of different things, and I mean, you don't need to necessarily implement all of them, but really these tools are intended for you to put in your back pocket, so that when you are coaching, when you are equipping, when you are discipling others, perhaps these are paradigms that you could also pass on as well and share. All right, so this first one that I wanted to walk through, and you'll see this in your book on page 7, page 7 here, is this idea of this gradual release of responsibility. So this gradual release of responsibility model, now how many of you are aware of the paradigm I do, you watch, I do, you help? Anyone? Yeah, okay, so it's a very common paradigm, and it's common because it's sticky, it works really well. But the reason we share this is because we often, as much as we might know it, we often don't do it. And and if we do it, we often start at the second stage instead of the first stage. Right now, what this first stage is, it really is encapsulated by this idea of intentional. So this here is your responsibility, and this here is the responsibility of those that you are discipling or training. Now, here I'll give you an example. I do, you watch. Let's say you're talking about. Let's say you're meeting in a school, right? You're meeting in a school or in a portable location, or even beyond that. Let's say you have a brand new children's minister, right? A children's minister, a children's director who's going to be leading the ministry there. And you know, even if you look at that children's director and they're brand new, they're out of seminary, and this you know, he is trying to figure out how to do ministry. You might have experience in that, right? Or even so this idea of, okay, you need to train someone else or you need to disciple someone else. So let's stick with the setting up chairs example, because it's a visible one that we can use. So if you are setting up chairs here, let's say even if it's for an event in your fellowship room or whatnot, and you're sitting around tables, you might have a way that you want to do it. Right? You may want to say, hey, the chairs need to be linked together like this, and then one needs to be behind the other, and there needs to be, what is that, about 20 centimeters, like there. And some of you might be, you know, it's like, hey, we need to maximize the space, so instead of just having it like that, you can do 20 centimeters, and then the next chair is here, and the next chair is here. Right? So let's say you were in charge of this ministry, right? You're in charge of this ministry, and you've just been doing that all the time, and you've had helpers, and then you're not going to be there that week. Right? What do you often do? Say, hey, you know, you were here this entire time. You probably know what to do. Can you go and just figure it out? And we start from there. There's no intentionality in it. Now, the problem with that is that individual may not have actually been paying attention. Right? Here's another example. If I said to you, David, right, David, you are going to be leading this seminar tomorrow. Right, with the Anglicans down the road, or with your church. Exactly. You know, here are my notes, and you're going to be leading this tomorrow. If I'd said that to any one of you, you probably would have listened differently up until this point, right? Not to say that you weren't listening, right? But we probably would have taken a little bit more careful notes and said, oh, this is the opener, this, right? I mean, that's just the way it is. So in the same way with the setting up chairs, and in the same way as when we are equipping someone else, we often just start here, oh, you just help, without really verbalizing or clarifying what is the reason for them doing that. So if I had said to David right from the morning, hey, David, let's be intentional here. David, tomorrow you're going to be leading this exact same seminar right before we started. So I'm going to do this and I want you to watch. That is very different than I'm doing and you're helping. So let's say we do that, right? So I do, you watch, and then we move to the next step, which is the guide in ministry, which is I do, and then you're going to help. And then the collaborative ministry is you do, and then I help, and the equip ministry is you do, I watch. Let's draw it a different way. And this is actual situational leadership by Ken Blanchard. Who's aware of that? Situational leadership, Ken Blanchard. So that, once again, it's the book, Leadership in the 1 Minute Manager, a fantastic read. So I'm not actually going to walk through what that is. You can pick up that book. I mean, it really is a fast read, and it's a good one. It'll be very helpful. But I wanted to talk about the paradigm here in situational leadership in relation to micromanagement. Now, no one is ever going to, if you're getting up to speak or you're introducing yourself to someone else, you're never going to say, hi, my name is Daniel, and I am a professional micromanager. Right? We don't pride ourselves on being micromanagers. In fact, if you probably, when someone asks, how do you like to be managed or to work with others, you don't say, I love to be micromanaged, right? It feels a little bit demeaning at times, and it's like, well, I know what I'm doing. And even if you do need a little bit of a direction, we don't really like that label, micromanagement, right? And as a result, if you are highly competent, right, and you're like, I don't need to be micromanaged, it goes back to that phrase, we often lead the way that we've been led, or teach the way that we've been taught unless we consciously do so otherwise. If you are highly competent and you don't really like micromanaging, you probably don't want to micromanage someone else. Right? Do we see how that passes on there? So when you look at this paradigm here of directing, coaching, supporting, delegating, right? So this here is a quadrant where it's directive. You're highly directive along this side, and you're highly supportive up to there. It really does parallel this gradual release of responsibility, right? So here is I do, you watch, right? So this is I'm going to set up the chairs, and you're going to watch to see how we do it. And then the S2 is coaching, so it's still directive, but now supportive. And it's like, okay, now I'm going to, instead of me setting up all the chairs, I'm going to set up the first chairs in each of the rows, the first 2 chairs in each of the rows, and you're going to help. And then here, your directive is a little bit lower. Now you're supporting more. So you're saying, hey, I'm really only going to set up that very first chair, and you're going to do the rest. And then at the end, it's the delegating, it's the equip ministry where it's like, you've been walked through, you know what needs to happen, and you're going to lead that ministry in this way. Now, if you do not bring someone all the way through, all right, and you assume that they know what they need to do in order to get things done, they might still get what you want them to, they might still get done what you want them to get done, but they'll probably do it in a different way, right? And that way, maybe it's pastoral care, right? Yes, they're still going to do the hospital visit, but if you haven't trained them or taught them and equipped them to be able to do it the way that needs to be done, maybe they're just going to go and say something that they ought not to say, right? Which can happen a lot when it comes to hospital visits, right? Anyone mess up? I mean, I know I have many times. So that's why this is important, because it does communicate values. It's a way for you to actually move someone through and help them understand the values of your church. Now, let me give you an example. I'm sure there's individuals in your congregations, maybe they're CEOs or they're high capacity or they're well-trained or maybe they've been to seminary. And, you can probably think of someone in your congregation that's just high capacity, right? High capacity. Sometimes we can feel a little threatened by individuals who are really high capacity. Now, we wouldn't probably ever verbalize that to one another, but inward, if we were to peel back the curtain, sometimes we do feel threatened, and we're like, hey, and if I don't give this person ministry, if I don't equip them, then they're probably going to leave and go down to the church down the road or move somewhere else, right? So, has anyone ever thought that, or is that just me? All right, so we have those people in our congregation. So the thing that we often do, and this is because we don't like being micromanaged, and we think the person's a CEO, the person lives in a $5 million home, right? And it's like we're threatened by that. We're like, well, if I micromanage them and really walk them through the I do you watch, I do you help, you do I help, you do I watch, and they're probably going to be, they probably already know what to do, right? So what we do is we just kind of release him here, or we release him here, or we put him here and we do him there, right? And what happens? Well, they're not doing it the way we want to do it. So then the next time a scenario like that happens, and this piles up over years of ministry experience, the next time someone like that happens, we're a little bit more reticent to release ministry to them, right? Because they're never going to be able to do it the way that we want them to do it. Now, if God has called us to be equippers, if that is the case, how do you actually move a high-capacity individual from here all the way to here? Well, it's by showing them your cards, right? And I remember this actually came up in one of the portions here where it's like it kind of feels good. I believe you're the one who said it kind of feels good to be the pastor. It feels good to be wanted. It feels good to be needed. If we're completely honest with ourselves, we do like that, right? But if you're actually going to be moving someone from directing, coaching, supporting to delegating, you can actually have a conversation, a developmental conversation. And that's why we're going to be presenting a leadership pipeline and why this is so important. Because you can actually present this and have a conversation, have tea or coffee with the individual and say, hey, I know God is equipped. I know you're bringing a lot of experience. I know God has called you and is using you and is developing you and shaping you. And I would love to release the keys to this ministry for you. Do that, but I need to make sure that we understand. You understand the values of our church, the vision of our church, the strategy. I need to understand that we're on the same page. So I'm actually gonna be a part of you walking through. You're gonna serve in this area, and then we're gonna try to move you through. But we need to start here. And just by having that honest conversation, we often say no for people, right? And especially when it comes to recruiting. It's that phrase, don't say no for someone. And that's an important phrase when it comes to evangelism and equipping your congregation, especially when Easter is coming up or there's another Sunday and you're asking them to invite. Who can you invite? Just by saying, hey, don't say no for someone. Don't say someone's no for them, because that's what we often do. And not only as it relates to evangelism, but it relates to volunteering. And we're like, oh, but this individual has just become a new mother, and she has 2 children at home, and she's probably not getting a lot of sleep. Man, how can I ask her to serve? And if she does serve, she'll probably be guilty and maybe feel shamed into doing it. And I can't do that. I'm going to ask when the kids grow up a little bit more, right? Or this individual, man, this person. I remember this conversation where we had this group, this individual. We wanted to start schools in a portion of Africa with with individuals that we were partnering with. So we went to a wealthy individual in our church, and this guy was like, he the Jesus film. Like this guy, he funded the Jesus. Like he paid for. Like this guy was loaded, right? I was living in Edmonton. It was like oil country. Right, and this guy and he funded. So we went and we were like, "Hey, can you help us? Give us $10,000, to be able to build this one school." And he's like, "No, I don't want to. But if you have a vision to start 100 schools, then I'll fund that." And we're like, "Whoa, we were afraid just to ask him for $10,000 for one school, right?" And it's the vision. So don't say no for people. All right. So the last thing that I want to share is this idea of lead and lag metrics, and then Todd's going to come up and continue for us. All right, so lead and lags. We talked about metrics right here, and if you're familiar with if you're interested in this, there's a book called The 4 Disciplines of Execution where you can learn a little bit more about that. But when we come to metrics, we often say, hey, I want to grow my church by 100, or I want to double my attendance, or have more evangelistic growth by 50%, or see 10 people come to know Christ this next year instead of just 5 like this past year. Right? We have these goals like this. These are lag goals. But what are the things that we can actually do, right, the lead metrics to get to that, right? And the best way to illustrate this is dieting, right? If you've ever tried to lose weight, right, and it's winter here, I realize. Scott Sanders took me into the water at Manly Beach on Saturday, and that was fun. He says that I almost drowned a couple times, but I was just playing him. No?
I don't think so.
Yeah,
I don't think so.
It was fun. It was fun.
I was sitting on a bench watching, and I don't believe that.
There's no proof to just so. All right.
Yeah.
So basically, it's winter here. But when I was back home, I just dropped my family off up in Canada before coming down here. It's summer. It was about 30, 35 degrees, and a lot of people are saying, especially when it comes to that time of the year, it's like, hey, I need to lose 5 kilos, right? Or I need to lose, right, this amount of weight. So you say, this is the first way that we diet. We say, I need to lose 5 kilos. I need to lose 5 kilos. And what do? We have that resolve, so when it's lunchtime, we eat salad, right? And then when it's dinner, you're like, yeah, I'm gonna eat salad as well. But the person next to you has a great it's pad thai, right? Or it's a great steak or something, or fish and chips. Right? They're having fish and chips, and you're thinking about your salad, and you're like, well, I ate salad for lunch. I can probably have fish and chips here. I'll just skip breakfast tomorrow, and I should be good to go. Right? We kind of justify. So that's the first way we try to diet. We just have this end goal of I need to lose 5 kilos. Well, the second way that we try to lose weight, or we're like, okay, is like, you go to Macca's, right? I'm learning. Right? You go to Macca's, and then there's a sign I noticed. It says your average daily intake is 8,700 kilojoules, right? Right. So you look at that, and you're like, okay, well, if a Big Mac is 3,000 kilojoules, and this is this, and then you try to calculate, right? So you think, you know what, I'm just going to not eat as much. I'm going to make sure my intake is a little bit lower, not to get over that 8,700 kilojoule threshold, and I'm going to walk, right? We're going to, it's like we walked along this room twice, so you probably got 200 steps in. So you get enough steps in, and you're probably going to be good, right? So we have these things that we measure. There are these lead metrics that we do that we're like, hey, it'll probably lead to losing the 5 kilos. That's the second way we try to lose weight. The third way is by combining and saying, hey, I'm this old, I weigh this much, and I need to lose 5 kilos by this amount of time, and there are calculators online that do it, and they say, okay, then you need to intake 8,400 instead of 8,700 kilojoules every single day. So you do that by either eating less, eating healthier, or exercising more, right? And that's the connection between the lead and the lag. So when it comes to ministry, when it comes to equipping the saints for the work of ministry, especially as it relates to recruiting, you probably have gaps, right? And you're like, hey, we need 5 more children's workers, right? Or we need 4 more ushers, and we have these gaps, right? We often just say, oh, we need to just find 5 more workers. And we just have this goal, this lag metric, this lag goal of getting 5 more people. But what are the things that you can do that'll lead to 5 more workers? Do you get that connection? Now, if you survey an average church, most pastors will say that it takes about 4 to 6 conversations with a brand new volunteer to get 1 new volunteer into the ministry. Right? So 4 to 6 conversations with a congregant or a parishioner to, 4 to 6 different asks. Can you serve? This is what the ministry is about. Can you serve? And then it's about that to find 1 new volunteer. Now this isn't it's more based on surveys, and as we've done this, that's kind of the number that seems to be consistent across the board. So if that's the case, and let's do a little math here. Right? Let's say you need 5 more volunteers, right, at the end of the quarter, right, new volunteers at the end of the quarter, right, then if it takes, let's say, 5 conversations to get 1 new volunteer, how many conversations do you need to have? Right, 5. So you get 25, right? So 25 conversations to get 5 new volunteers, and you need the 5 volunteers in 4 months, let's say, for example, 4 months. So then you say, okay, if that's the case, then how many conversations do I need to have this month, right? So let's do, for math's sake, let's do 5 months, right? You need 5 new volunteers in 5 months, right? So then every month you need 1 new volunteer, which is 5 conversations. That's in a month. So if that's the case, how many conversations do you need to have on a weekly basis? 1.25, right? So if you break it down to this and you're like, hey, if we need 5 new volunteers in every ministry area in 5 months, what would it look like if your volunteers, your leaders, your coaches, ministry directors, and senior leaders all had at least 1 to 2 conversations every week with someone new or someone who's engaged and challenge them to begin serving? Right? Do you see? Now, this isn't what I'm encouraging you to do. It's more of a, do you see the connection between the lead and the lag? The things that we can do that are going to result? All right, so Todd's going to tease that out, give us a little bit more context for all this, and we're going to keep on going.
So one of the things I would do before we move on from page 7 is Daniel didn't have enough room to write here, but go ahead and put "we talk." Put a comma and "we talk" after "I do," "you watch," "we talk." "I do," "you help," "we talk." We in this room are likely a result of a person, not necessarily a program or a process. And it's vitally important to recognize it's that those catalytic conversations that get us to the next point in time. So I wanted to go ahead and do that. What's the classic example of leadership development that's given from the Old Testament? Somebody give it to me. Or leadership. Moses and Jethro. So break it down for me. Somebody tell me what happened there. Anybody? There's some dudes you could get to help you in what? You do the tricky stuff, all right? So what happened? What happened there? It's a miracle because Moses, it's one of the miracles that happened. Yeah. But Moses listened to his father-in-law, and what did he do? Appoints judges, puts people in charge of tens, 50s, hundreds, thousands, and we see that, and that's often like, this is delegation. Another thing I will point out that's a very culture-forming thing that he did was that went up from God and got the Ten Commandments because those were very culture-forming things as well. So that is the thing that's often, touted as, hey, here's an example of leadership. But I would say the interesting thing that a friend of mine, Eric Geiger, pointed out to me one time, and I just thought was gold, and I still am giving him credit. It's been 3 years, so I'm just saying, at some point in time, I'm gonna have to steal that. He's already put it in a book, so I can't. But he said, "Hey, we were at lunch one day, and he was like, hey, have you ever thought about?" We talk leadership development incessantly. He's like, "Have you ever noticed this? When Moses dies in Scripture, you see, Joshua goes in and he takes the land. Joshua dies in chapter 34 of Deuteronomy, and what happens?" And I said, "Well, it's the book of Judges. I mean, everybody does what's right in their own mind. It kind of comes unfurled." And he's like, "Why do you think that is?" And I'm like, I don't know. He said, "Well, the interesting thing to me is when I look at it, I see that when Moses went up on the mountain, Joshua was with him. When Moses went in to the tent of meeting, Joshua was with him. Joshua was basically eavesdropping on some of those conversations with God." And then so, we began to talk about that, and then we began to talk about the life of Christ. And I'm not going to, go through, but I mean, he actually went through when I drew up knowledge, experience, and coaching one day on the board, and he's much more holier than I am because he went home immediately that weekend, and he went through the Gospels and wrote down every time he saw knowledge, every time he saw experience, every time he saw coaching in the life of Christ and the connection with the disciples. Because what was really interesting is then he comes back the next time we meet. We're supposed to be meeting about, our jobs because he's my boss, but most of the time it ends up being about leadership development because we're both, again, passionate about it. But he says, "Hey, look at this. Look at how much the conversations that were had, or even when there was a large crowd gathered, he was going back here and breaking it down for the disciples. And so when you look at situational leadership, when you look at, how leadership is transferred, and how values are transferred, like what we value, what our church vision and values and all this is transferred by people. It's not transferred by paper. We can't just simply create a wonderful graphic and throw it up on the wall and or preach through it once a year. It's transferred by people, and that's a big cultural issue. So if we look at page 9, I think this is a really, really helpful construct to think about conviction, culture, and construct. So what we're trying to do from this point through the rest of the day is move from conviction. Hopefully we've all agreed and we have a burning hot conviction for developing people in our churches. We want to see that come out. And hopefully week to week you have a burning hot conviction for developing your people, and that's apparent. But then it has to, the other two things have to align as well. Culture, your culture has to back that up. Your constructs or your systems and processes and the policies and all the things that you put into place have to align up with that. So we are most effective when we have those three things in alignment. When we have the systems and processes without the clear conviction, it's all air. I mean, it's apathy. Like, why are we even doing this? Why does this matter? Why am I not serving, in a nonprofit? Why am I not in the United Way? The thing that makes us different, the thing that makes us unique, the thing that makes us that we should be the best leadership developers in our community is the gospel, and understanding the gospel, and understanding that developing people is our number one goal. All right, so then if you have that conviction, that's most important. But if you have constructs without the culture, if you have the systems and processes and you have a strong conviction, but you don't have the culture, people become exhausted because they don't know what a win looks like. When you have conviction without constructs, you get frustration because you're getting me really excited, but I don't know where to go. I don't know what to do. It's not clear to me. And in my circles, and just from what I know, from having been with you guys the last couple of days, I would say that you guys, you have put your money where your mouth is. You've invested through, I see a heavy investment in church planting, in leadership development. Everybody, and it may be just the people that, you all are bringing to us, but it doesn't seem to be the issue. It may be a clarity issue. It may be clarity in constructs. Are we giving people, do they know what a win looks like? Have we made it easy, obvious, and strategic what their next step is? It's great to have a program. Programs are awesome. But everybody thinks steps, not programs. Like, how am I going to get a person from here to here? The program, it doesn't matter. Those will change over the course of time. Things come and things go. But that think steps, not programs is really important. All right. So there's really, yes. Okay. Culture. And I think somebody said something about it back here. Let me, it may take me just a little bit to draw this, but I'm going to draw it anyway because I think it's helpful to understand what I'm talking about. There's really 3 levels of shared ministry. This comes from Howard Hendricks. You may have heard this kind of language before. Probably they didn't attribute it to Howard Hendricks. They attributed it to a couple other younger bucks that were in one of his classes. He was a brilliant professor at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's got a book called Living by the Book that's really, really helpful as well for people to understand Bible reading and application. His analogies are awesome. But he talked about 3 levels of shared ministry. There is dumping, delegating, and developing. So, I would take his framework, and I'm going to put a framework from a guy named Noel Teachy, who is a business guy, but a brilliant guy, and he talks about how leadership development usually happens in organizations. And I think I've adjusted his a little bit because of what it means in the church, but we're often guilty of this as well. So, the question is, are we dumping, delegating, or developing people? When we dump, we only care about the job. We only care about the role. It's, hey, I have to have a certain amount of people in this children's class to keep it open. The diocese says I have to have this ratio, or I can't have a class. So, and that's not to say that we shouldn't have those things. We should. They're important. But if we shift toward a warm body mindset instead of developing a weekly volunteer, we get into trouble. In that case, we're looking at, commanding. Commanding means, hey, if you're a member here, you serve in children's this many times a year. We conscript people into service. Oh, you have a preschooler? Then that means you have to serve once, every so many weeks. I mean, we do that in the Baptist church some, so I'm assuming some of those things have happened here. Maybe not. But command or tell. So command is like really not old school, but it's like, you will do this. Tell is a little bit nicer. Then we get teach, train. For the sake of time, I'm going to roll through this. Teach, train. Then we have model. And finally, coach or mentor or disciple or whatever you want to put in there. But that's, more personal in nature. So you have those kind of layers that are built in. If I was drawing a line here, I would say this is dumping, this is delegating, this is developing. How do we see ministry? This is, I don't care about the person, I just care about getting it filled. This is, I care about the person and the position. I actually am bringing people and saying, hey, I've met with you for coffee. You're obviously passionate about children's ministry, or you're obviously passionate about groups ministry. That's how you came to know Christ. I'm going to help you become a group leader. That's awesome. Or I'm going to delegate this task to you. But the third level is next level. Developing is saying, I'm going to develop the person for the position. Or I'm going to develop that person for at least a layer of leadership in the church. So that was kind of a long answer to your question. So hopefully it was a valuable deviation. But if you don't have to have all of this. Just remember 3 levels of shared ministry. I can dump, I can delegate, or I can develop. This, of course, as you go up, it takes more time. But I would say it also increases effectiveness. Or, in our case, competency, but effectiveness as well. Does that make sense? Cool, I'm running out of, we got a new one. Running out of things. Anybody else have any questions while I erase this and draw up a pipeline? Okay. Yes. Right. Yeah. I think that's something that I think hopefully you're creating the scoreboard for the church and that's something that you can help them process through. I mean, it's one thing, the part of the problem is, I don't know, again, about your churches, and this church doesn't have one, but if you go in a classic Southern Baptist church, just to usually the left of the preacher is the numbers. It's how many were in Sunday school. It's what the giving was last week. It was all these. I mean, they're right there for everybody to see. It is a clear scoreboard. That's not the case in most churches now. My dad's church still has it, and at least one of my uncle's churches I know that I've been to still has it. And that's a clear representation to the congregation, what the level of giving is and everything. It's kind of crazy. But I think we have an opportunity in how we preach to say what's important. And if we set that out there, like when we were moving toward campuses, first of all, we started out with why we were moving to campuses. We were going to campuses because we're going to reach lost people. We said, don't go we were a regional draw. We were a regional church. And we said, don't go if this is just going to be more convenient for you. Go if you're going to lead or serve, because otherwise we need your seat for lost people. We would do that, and we would reinforce that as we would get toward the launch of a campus, because we would say, hey, we're having these preview days for you to go and look. Because if you just want to go and look, that's great. It'll give us a chance to do walkthroughs and make sure that we're good to go when our guests show up. But again, don't come unless you're going to lead or serve. We want to invite you to our prayer service for the lost people in this community. We want to invite you into serving opportunities on Saturdays, cleaning up the neighborhood. We're going to I know you're not going to attend this campus, but this is where we're going. This is our vision to reach DC with the gospel message of Christ. So we're going to ask you to throw on a T-shirt, and it will say, Moco was one of our campuses, and Silver Spring was one of our campuses. So you're going to go into Silver Spring and serve that community. Right now we only have 40 people that are going with us, but we want to show up with an army and love that neighborhood so that before we go, we're making a good impression. So all those things, I think, help reinforce, where we're going, or reinforce the 10 campuses in 10 years. That was a big, wildly important goal that we set in front of the congregation, and we made sure that we were doing things to back that up. When you're looking at 4 disciplines of execution, it's really important to say, hey, what are those wildly important goals that we all share? What scoreboard are we going to have? What lead measures and lag measures are we going to, focus on that scoreboard, and then have a regular cadence of accountability. So every week when we gather together in a meeting, we're going to discuss what that goal is, and we're going to make adjustments on that. If our lead measure or lag measure isn't working, if my body has suddenly become aware that I'm trying to lose weight and it's set a new bar, and I may have to lower my calorie intake a little bit more, or I may have to increase the number of steps I'm doing a day. It's a constant thing of saying, okay, we're going to hit this, but we don't want to get to that point and then wonder why it didn't happen. Does that make sense? Okay, cool. Probably camped out on that too long. Sorry about that. All right, so when we're looking at leadership pipeline, this is the visual that I want you to see. A lot of times, you can flip over to page 10. A lot of times when I say, hey, have you heard of Leadership Pipeline? And I'm talking to a church or even a business, they'll say yes. And I say, draw it. And they will draw me something like this. And they'll have like a linear process. I'm moving somebody through. Sometimes they'll draw a funnel. And that is not a pipeline, that's a pipe dream. Or rocket ship is what Scott told me it was. But what happens is that does not represent the true nature of what happens when someone moves from one level of leadership to another in any organization. I don't care whether you're talking about a business or in the church world. What happens is this. When someone is an individual contributor or a volunteer, they are leading self. So when they're leading self, we are asking, hey, is this person doing well at that? The answer is yes. They're responsible. They're showing up on a weekly basis. They're not a sociopath. They're not causing problems in the team. I'm going to put them over people. And then we ask them to lead others. So they move from being a volunteer to a leader. Now, what got them here won't make them a good leader, traditionally, because now a mind shift has to take place. That's why the linear path is not valid, because how you spend your time, what you value, how you interact with others has to shift. Most of the time, people wash out here because they just try to be a better doer. Whether, I don't care what role it is. So what we're saying is, hey, we recognize that there are steps that we want people to take. And that at a certain point, we want there to be a dotted line here between each of these, not a solid line here, but a dotted line between, to say, hey, as a person comes to a role, as they're a volunteer, and they move from learning it, they're new at it, to leading well in it, becoming more proficient or competent in it, then we want them to move to the next step, which is multiplying themselves there. So we would say, hey, a big part of the philosophy needs to be that volunteers recruit and develop all other volunteers. They're in the best place. They're positioned in the best place to be able to recruit and develop other people. They're actually doing it. They have friends in the church or people in their small group or, whoever. They are the best people to bring people in and begin to multiply. Once I see them multiplying, that's when I'm going to make sure that I'm giving them training to be a leader. That training happens before they're a leader, not after. We talked about, I guess, I don't know, my days are confused now, but Daniel and Scott going in to the ocean the other day. Now, I want to tell you quickly, because it came up the other day. I've never used this analogy before, but I'm glad it came up. So I'm from, the middle of nowhere, Kentucky. These are not terribly cosmopolitan people. So the way I learned to swim was my dad and my uncle just repeatedly threw me in the water. I'm not joking. Anybody else learn to swim like that? Nobody else learned to swim like that? You guys are much nicer than... I'm telling you, that was a common way. Okay. Well, believe me, yes. There was some, in our home, there was, corporal punishment was there. And, my dad's belt hung under a plaque that said, "I need thee every hour." Just kidding. Okay. That's bad. Now you think I come from an abusive home. This is great. I thought this was a fairly common thing where you're thrown in until you learn how to swim. You keep going back in, keep going back in, keep going back in. Okay, well, okay, fine. It worked the other day. Why did it work the other day? You were more polite? All right, so the whole idea is this. Basically, that's the way I learned how to swim. Why? Because probably that's the way my dad and my uncle learned how to swim. But it doesn't mean that we have to continue doing it in that way. Mark from this church, we pulled up on, what's Mark's name? Will these guys know Mark? Maybe? One of your M guys? Okay. So Mark drives up the other night. Hopefully this one does work. And he gets out of the car, and there's an L on the front of his car, an L plate. And I'm like, I said, is that for like a driver, a learning driver? They were like, yeah. And I said, well, what do you have to do to get a driver's license in Australia? And so they told me, hey, you have to study and pass a written test. Then you have to drive with you have to log 100 and some hours with somebody in the driver's seat next to you, and you have to go back and pass another test, and it just kind of kept going on. It was a beautiful example of knowledge, experience, and coaching, which I loved. But it was also an example of how someone learns and develops. It was also an example of this, because I said, hey, why do you all do that? Why do you do that? Because the government says so, but why would the government say so? To reduce fatalities. Lives are at stake. But how many of us were given significant keys to ministry before we were trained and developed, before we were ready? And I would say, may it never be. May I never be guilty of doing that to somebody else again. And it was most likely because that's the way it was done for them, or they had a dumping mentality, or even if they had a delegating mentality, I still wasn't ready, and I still wasn't brought along because they didn't have a process to do so. So that's a big part of what we're trying to do here over the next couple of hours. So when you look at leading self, leading others, then it becomes the coach level or leading leaders, leading a ministry, and then finally, leading the church. So a senior leader in the church. Each one of these, kind of has a dotted line. I will say, depending on polity and things like that, there's not a line that is like paid staff and non-paid staff or anything like that. I come from a Bible church, and so, we would have put our elders up here for sure. They were leading the church. So I just want to toss that out there as well. The whole idea, though, is understanding and recognizing that at each one of these levels, people are in a different level of competency or development, and it's important for us to figure out where they are and draw them up. So we wanted to make sure that we begin to do that and walk through that. My question to you at your tables is this. Just take a few moments to talk about whether you think you're dumping, delegating, or developing. Just want to give you like 5 minutes to do so. And it may be that you have that in one area of ministry and not the other. So are you doing it, and what ministries do you have a tendency to do that in your church? Good deal? All right, take a few minutes. one more minute or so. We're about 20 minutes or a little bit less from lunch, so stick with me. All right. Let's go ahead and tap back in. So I won't ask anybody to confess the broad category. I'll let you throw somebody else under the bus. So what areas do we have a tendency, what areas of ministry in our churches do we have a tendency to dump on people? The creche? Ooh. Say that again. Well, the first part. Parish council. Yeah. Right. Gotcha. Yeah. You guys sound a lot like Baptists. We actually have a committee on committees in our national convention. It's really hilarious. I'm like, really? There's a committee on committees? This is crazy. Anybody else? What? Yeah. Last call. Small group leading? So talk about that a little bit. The small group self-appoints a leader. That's a little scary. Yeah. Right. No. Yeah. And oftentimes in any situation where there's a vacuum in leadership, the person with the loudest voice or the clearest vision, doesn't matter the quality of either, is the person who's seen as the leader. One more. Right. Okay, so I would break that down a little bit differently in a group setting. So it depends on the model, if you have an apprenticeship model or what type of model you have in groups. One of the first things that I would look at in a group is I would say, hey, I need a group leader. Group leader, one of your jobs is to make sure that you have somebody doing social, and here's a role description to help you, ask that person to do that. Somebody needs to do socials. Get-togethers, not social media. That would be a different thing. I want somebody to do the serving, like help us to serve, once a month or however often, we're going to be serving in our community as a group. I want somebody to, make sure that they're doing the prayer portion. And I think when you're doing that, you are saying this. So when I said volunteers recruit and other volunteers, in a small group setting, that would mean just coming to the group. The volunteers aren't recruiting I would put the small group person, and this is important for where we go today, as how you define these roles and how you define these levels. I would actually put the small group leader in this position. And I would say the small group leader's job is to recruit and develop other leaders. So in that case, he's dipping into a small group and seeing who is faithful, available, and teachable, to say, hey, I'm gonna draw you up. Or he's gonna say, hey, one of those 3 people that I gave those 3 jobs, I'm gonna see who's responsible, who's responsive and responsible, and I'm gonna bring them in. Far too many times we will, and I'm not saying apprenticeship model is bad. I'm saying sometimes we put all our eggs in one basket, when we should be really looking at the whole group and saying, who can I draw out? Who can I give a little job to that will come out? So some people are so scared of commitment. If you ask them to be an apprentice, they won't do it. But secretly, you are asking them to do a little job and seeing if they're and drawing them out. Because again, think steps, not programs. Think about, okay, what next step, little step, can I have this person take? It may take them a while to get there, but if I ask them, to make a leap, they might not get there. But I want to help encourage them to move along. When we look at Pipeline, I want you to understand that. So let's break that down really quickly. If I'm looking at this, moving from a volunteer to a leader, I'm looking for this person to be let's forget small groups. Let's use like ushering or something like that. I'm moving from this person from learning to leading, and when I begin to see them multiplying, that is the dotted line that they cross where I'm like, okay, they're ready to be a leader. I'm going to train them to do that. How I do that is looking at competency. So this is also important to talk about when we look at competency. We want to think about something that is scalable. And when I start to talk about scalable, everybody starts accusing me of pragmatism. And I'm not saying anything about pragmatism. I'm just saying, hey, let's simplify it so that we can be clear in what we're asking people to do. Let's simplify it, because how many people have volunteers serving in 2 or 3 or more ministries in their church? Okay, everybody. This is why this is important. When I was moving toward doing campuses, and I had launched 2, and I was like, this is a struggle. It is drudgery. I feel like I'm dragging a dead mule through the mud. How am I going to do more of these if I can't, get this done? So I said, you know what? It seems to me that everybody has gone Book of Judges and done what is right in their own mind, and every ministry seems to have a different application to get into ministry. So I did an audit, and after 26 different types of application, I stopped. And I said, we are going to have one application. And there was wailing and gnashing of teeth. And I'm special. You don't understand me. You don't understand my ministry. All of that. And I'm like, well, okay, 80% of everything that we need is covered on this application. If you need an addendum, children's, I understand that we only require background checks in your area. That doesn't mean we need to throw everything else out because of one instance. Short-term trips. I understand that leading a short-term trip is different than leading a small group. I totally get that. But 80% of what we need to know is on this application. Likewise, most of what we need to know, most of what makes you a good small group leader will make you a good trip leader. So let's be really clear about building core competencies and saying, hey, if you're serving at our church as a leader, you should have core competencies and role-based competencies. If you're serving in 2 or 3 different areas, why do we need to all have 2 or 3 different types of training? We do, but not for everything. Most of what we need to know should be covered in core competencies, then role-based skills. Yes, you're a small group leader and you're a trip leader. Yes, you're leading 8 to 10 ushers on a Sunday morning. I get that. You need specialized training, but most of what we need to know should be a standard thing so that as people move from place to place in our church, which we all know they're going to, or they already are, we don't look like jackwagons. We actually look like we know what we're doing because we're saying, hey, I'm going to give you a role description, and it's going to look similar to your role description in this other area. We're not going to have everybody has their own role descriptions. Everybody has their own meeting process. Everybody has their own onboarding process. Everybody has their own. We're going to streamline that and say, hey, you can make this unique. You can make this your own, but 80% of it is going to be the same because as people move from position to position, we don't want to waste their time. If we waste their time, they won't give it to us anymore. If we waste their time, they think we're dumping on them, not developing them. And so when we do this, when we get to a place where we can say, hey, we agree on these core competencies, we can move forward. So at Lifeway, when I first came there, we had our HR department had created a cruise to nowhere when it came to training. I came from D.C. up in the ports of Baltimore. There's these massive cruise ships because the Eastern Seaboard is extremely young. All young professionals padding their resumes from D.C. up to Jersey and New York, and people would come down to Baltimore and go out on a cruise to nowhere. They were advertised all the time, really cheap because they wanted you to get on there and spend money. But they literally didn't go anywhere. They would go out for 3 or 4 days. Like whenever you had a long weekend, they were massive. I mean, huge cruise ships full of people. And all they would do is they'd go out into the ocean, meander around, and you were back right where you started. Great buffet, great time, but it didn't go anywhere. And so I would say, again, may it never be. Let's make sure that we have destinations and ports of call along the way, and people know where they're going, and we're moving them through a process. So, with all that being said, I think it's vitally important that we understand when we're talking about pipeline, we're talking about moving people through steps. We're talking about making sure that you have core competencies and role-based skills. So this really, you're really starting to see the framework that we're talking about. I do think it's adaptable, and I definitely think it's scalable. Like I said, we went from a couple of campuses to a bunch of campuses fairly quickly, but we would never have been able to do that without beginning to really streamline how we developed leaders and making sure that we still had the quality there, making sure that everybody came up from within. You have 2 choices. You can either buy leaders or build leaders. When you look around your staff table, let me ask you a question. Who did you inherit or buy, and who did you develop? Think about your best guys. Think about the best people in your church. Did you inherit them, or did you develop them? And so that's the goal, that's the grit, that's where we're trying to get to today. So talk about that for a minute. Talk about some of your best leaders and what are the core competencies that make those leaders great. So think about some of your best leaders at your church, your poster child guy, or gal. What would you say are the competencies? What are they good at? What do they embody? What do they value that make them a good leader? Talk amongst yourselves. Is it in the back, or how is it? It may be a little warm. What? got a couple more minutes, and then I want you to share one or two competencies from each table before lunch. Then we'll grab lunch right after.